All right. Hello, everybody. This week I am talking about the book A Canticle for Leibowitz, which was written by Walter M. Miller Jr. I kind of felt like I was neglecting sci-fi a little bit, and so I went for a look, and there's a book that there is on the archive. They have a copy of it that you can borrow that is like all the different Hugo-winning novellas and short stories, right? And it's just a collection of these relatively short pieces of fiction that won the Hugo Awards. Now, the very, very first novella winner was a story called The Darfstellar by Walter M. Miller Jr. That was in 1955, according to the book. And so, I thought, okay, cool, maybe I'll read this. And so I went to go look around, see if there was different copies of the story. This is a novelette or a novella. And every book that I found, every book cover that I found about the Darfstellar was like, a print from much later on. It's like, from the creator of A Canticle for Leibowitz. And I'm like, okay, clearly someone is pointing me in the direction of hey, if you want a full-length novel by Walter M. Miller Jr., go read A Canticle for Leibowitz. It's, blah, blah, blah. I didn't really read too much about, like, what they said about it, but it's like, it was in big type, sometimes slightly diagonal on covers and stuff like that. And so I said, okay, let's see if there's a copy of that. And in fact, I did find one on the archive. And I figured, what the heck, I'll give this a shot and see if it's any good. And it's one of those stories, one of those books where the name kind of rang a bell. Like, I've heard of A Canticle for Leibowitz, but I've never read it before Sunday. So, apparently it was originally published in 1959. And, what I found was how can I put this? After finally reading the whole thing, I think it's a pretty darn good book. It has a lot of really excellent world building, and a lot of other good stuff. With the caveat that, when you look at its tone, its characters, the interesting ideas and perspectives that appear in the book, there are some really good bits within those categories. But at the same time, each of those categories has some reservations as to its goodness, which is what I'll get into as we go forward. So let's start with kind of the best part, the world building. This is kind of one of those stories where it is a post-apocalyptic tale, but it's told from a very unique perspective, from the perspective of Catholic monks who have tried to save and salvage as much of the knowledge from the pre-apocalypse as possible. This is kind of a tried and true world, tried and true, setting, I guess. Desert and radioactive hordes and yada, yada, yada. All that fun, good stuff, but viewed from this very unique and very, honestly, interesting perspective. And it's handled by Miller in a very, I guess you would say, an authentic way, something like that. It's gritty without reveling in it. And it's kind of sad and pitiful, and yet with an air of upliftingness to it all at the same time. It's a really interesting mix as far as that goes. One of the things about the book that kind of threw me off was that there's a lot of Latin in there, and I was like to myself, I said, my first impression whenever I see an author doing lots and lots of foreign language without giving you a really good idea of what's being said in the foreign language, right? Whenever I see that, I kind of get this feeling that it's like annoying preening, right? It's like, oh, I know this language, so I'm going to throw it in there. And it'd be like if I threw a bunch of random Japanese into something that I wrote, and didn't tell you what I was saying. The thing about it is that, when authors do it, I find it irritating unless I can come up with a really good reason why they did it other than to just be like, hey, I know this language. And here's the neat thing that I discovered. I didn't know this, but apparently, like, the Latin Mass persisted up through, like, a good chunk of the 1960s and somewhat even later. So, like, this is something that was a thing back in 1959 and before when Miller was writing, but was totally gone by the time I was a kid, right? So, everybody, people my age are who grew up in a household where we went to church occasionally or religious or frequently or whatever, are used to masses being in the vernacular, whereas in 1959 it was very common for masses to be in Latin. And so a lot of the Latin in this book is actually stuff that if you had been going to church in the 50s, you would have heard this Latin on a regular basis, and probably you knew what it meant. So on that aspect, I kind of forgive Miller for including all of this Latin, because he couldn't possibly have known that the Latin Mass was on its last legs, at least in common parlance. And so, it's one of those things. It's funny because, I even, when I was a kid, I even got sent to catechism and stuff like that, and they never taught us any of the history of this. Like, oh yeah, we used to have Latin Masses up until this year, and there was this encyclical, and yada, yada, yada. Like, for someone who actually went through all the steps for all that stuff, I didn't know any of this stuff. I didn't know anything about the Latin Mass and how long it persisted. I thought it was something that had gone away in the late 1800s or something like that. I just didn't know, because nobody ever told me. So I had to end up looking that up for this one, because I was like, wait a minute, this was 1959. Maybe there was still, and turns out it was really common still back then. In fact, it was still, I think it was not. If I remember, the first writing that said, okay, we should start moving over to the vernacular was in the 60s. So, I guess it was super common in Catholic churches for the Latin Mass to be happening in 1959. Another thing about this is that if you look at modern sci-fi authors, most of them would not be able to resist kind of parodying or satirizing genuine religious belief. And Miller, on the other hand, treats it pretty seriously, which is really, it's a combination of very interesting and very, a breath of fresh air, oddly enough, right? Because, it's ideas and stuff that are very, very old, but since we haven't heard them very often, certainly haven't heard them very often in science fiction stories that are kind of bringing up this kind of stuff, it's like, oh, this is what someone who genuinely believed this stuff might have said and thought and done. And we don't get much of that in modern writing. It's modern science fiction writing where religion shows up. It's usually some kind of caricature. Whereas in this, it is very much not a caricature. And that's not to say that there isn't some humor in this book. There are some parts that feel almost to the level of parody, but what happens is that later on in the story, they get put into a different perspective, and that kind of, if not completely blowing away the parody aspect, at least tempers it to a point where it's like, oh, I understand now why this person's reaction to this was so extreme, and, I wouldn't have thought of that until you showed me this thing later on that kind of makes the thing back earlier in the story make more sense. That's one of the things that I'm discovering about this book, is that, how can I put it? I finished a first reading, and then as I was working on the notes for this review, I went back and was looking through things, but there's a lot of things that happen late in the book that refer to things happening earlier that might make you want to go take another look. So this is actually a book where, even if you don't necessarily want to read it, every week or something like that, or read it multiple times, a second reading might actually be pretty rewarding for this book. So maybe I'll give it another look in a couple of weeks or something, but you guys don't need to worry about that. Okay, so another aspect of the story that was really well done. The characters, they feel very real and very human. And because of the setting that they're in, because of the upbringing that they've had, because of the life that they've lived, maybe they're not very relatable to you, but Miller does a very good job of giving you enough of an understanding of their motivations and making their motivations consistent enough that maybe they're not relatable to you, but they are understandable to you. And so, the character work in this book is very, very well done. The slight downside to the character work is that the book is written in 3 big parts that take place at different times, and so we don't get any large overarching character developments that happen over the course of the whole book. At best, you get someone moving from point A at 0.0% of the book to point B at 33.3% of the book, and there is that kind of development, but it does kind of, the format of the book does kind of truncate these things a little bit. Which is not to say that there isn't some really good development in each part, so I'll put that way. And there's another interesting aspect, is that there's even a little bit of bleed of the characters from one part to the next, basically. You'll find a little bit of reference to, oh, this person is kind of referring to this other character that appeared in the previous part, even though this part's happening later in time, kind of stuff like that. So I think that's pretty well done and pretty remarkable, honestly. The style of the prose is pretty solid, with nothing too crazily poetic, nothing too amazingly. It's not like you're gonna sit down and go slack-jawed at the beauty of Walter Miller's prose. I keep wanting to say Arthur Miller, different author, not Walter Miller's prose, which is not to say that it's bad, but it's pretty good. It's got a lot of detail where detail is needed. There are some very long descriptions, but it doesn't overdo them like I've seen some authors, do. You get very crucial details, and you get those little touches here and there where, like, oh, you get a hint of a facial expression or a nervous tick or a reaction that are done very, very effectively. And so while Miller does not belabor the point, he does create some very good descriptions where they're needed and where they're effective. The dialogue is pretty good. It's pretty believable for the most part. There are some places where things get a little bit kind of like too allegorical or something like that, where the dialogue kind of spins off into a rather cryptic and even silly direction. There's some of that, but in the end, if you look at the book as a whole, there's a lot of really interesting discussions and arguments, and these discussions and arguments, and even some monologues at times, like a character kind of talking to himself. We end up hitting on some really thought-provoking ideas, and not just like touching on them and giving you an answer, but more like asking questions and leaving it open for you to kind of think about it. It's really well, that's another part that I think was really satisfying about this book, with the slight downside that the majority of the parts that I found kind of philosophically interesting were in the third of the book, which means that you got to kind of wade through a bunch of stuff, and then finally you're like, whoa, and it's not that there's nothing interesting in the first two parts, but they're much more focused on kind of the world building aspects, whereas the third part is more like, let's see what our conclusions are now that we've done all this world building, and where does this world get us, basically. There were a few parts of the story that I thought were kind of, if not annoying, then frustrating or jarring, I guess. Early on in the first part, I think it was in chapter 6, there was a pretty significant chunk of maybe 2 pages or 2.5 pages where there's almost a fourth wall break. We're seeing each of these parts is basically told, from the third person, but kind of over the shoulder of a particular character. Usually, I think in each case, it's a different monk in the monastery at the time, right? And then in chapter 6, and so there was a lot of cool kind of description and world building, and you really kind of get to feel like you're close to this character. In the first chunk of the book, it's a guy named Brother Francis, and then right in chapter 6, which is in the first third of the book, there was suddenly this part where we kind of zoomed out and did like two or maybe even 3 pages of like really kind of authorial voice exposition, and like I found it very jarring. It actually kind of pushed me out of my immersion in the book, which happening in chapter 6 is not, it doesn't bode well, I guess is what I'll say. Like when that happened and I was reading, I was like, oh, is this going to do this, where it's constantly pushing me out of the story and then trying to pull me back in? The author has to do a lot more work if that's the case. And generally speaking, it's once your suspension of disbelief gets broken once, it doesn't really, it's hard to make it come back. It's like losing trust. It's easy to lose trust but hard to re-win it. There was a good chunk of fairly cryptic and almost irrelevant back and forth in the second part of the book as well. And like this is another point where I stopped and I was like, do I want to keep reading this? Like, because how can I describe it? It's just two characters kind of bantering, but not in like a fun way. It was like they were kind of like taking digs at each other, but not acknowledging each other's digs at each other, and having a conversation about like bed bugs. And it's like, what's going on here, right? I was so pushed out of my immersion in the book that I was like, should I stop? Should I just, I don't know. But I pressed on, and later on, at the very start of the third part of the book, there's another chunk of just like this weird cryptic stuff, and you're like jumping POVs back and forth, and it goes into a script, like a screenplay kind of format for a page and a half, and then there's this weird self-satirical kind of attempt at humor, and it doesn't work at all. It feels like a bad imitation of Douglas Adams kind of stuff. And like, on Sunday I read the first two parts. I'm like, okay, this is pretty good. And then the third day, that is to say, the third part I read on Monday, and I opened it up and I started reading the first 3 to 5, 6, 7, 10 pages, something like that. I'm like, what happened? Where did the interesting stuff go? And why am I getting all this weird, like, bad satire and humor that falls flat? And I continue to push on, and then I discovered that like most of the really interesting like stuff is in the third part. But man, like this book really wanted to force me out of immersion. In each part, there was a good chunk where I was like, I'm out. Okay, I'll push through, but man, I want to be out. It was a weird feeling. I'll just put it that way. I get the feeling, and the funny thing is that there is some good humor in the book. There's some banter that works. There's some fun kind of absurdities here and there. There's some good dialogue. There is some good humor in the book. And then Miller just goes forward and he totally flubs it here and there. And you're just like, what happened here? I just don't know. It was weird. And it pushed me out of the book. And it almost pushed me out of the book one time in each part. And I don't know why those parts of the book are there. But, by the time I finished the final, I got to the end of the third part, I was like, whoa, there's a lot of really cool, thought-provoking ideas and treatments of them in this book. And almost all of them are kind of crammed into this last third of the book. We get some really cool ideas and kind of perspectives on like, what makes time that you've spent doing something wasted? Like, that's a really big question, and there's a great part in the first part where that's addressed in an interesting and fun and even a little bit funny and endearing way, and it's like, that's really good. We have a discussion, an argument about the proper place and use of scholarship and the corrupting effects of money on scholarship in the second part. It's brilliant. It's really, really fun and interesting, and like, whoa, this is actually really cool to think about. And then we have in the third part all kinds of cool stuff. We have questions about the duality of laws of earth and God. We have thoughts on mercy and all kinds of weird stuff like that I'll get more into in the spoiler section. I guess I may say, let's get into the spoiler section, and I'll tell a little bit more about kind of stuff more in detail. But feel free to skip the spoiler section if you haven't read the book. All right, spoiler section. So this book is separated, as I mentioned before, in 3 parts. The first part, the name of the part is Fiat Homo, or Let There Be Man. And, people have often heard, whether you're religious or not, you've probably heard an English translation of the first few sentences of Genesis, the book of Genesis. And for some reason, I don't know, well, I mean, not for some reason, but I don't think that Let There Be Man is in there. I just thought this is Latin, and I didn't really think that much about it. But as we go on further, we'll see that there's actually something going on here that I think is worth at least mentioning. So this first part follows a monk whose name is Francis, and it basically follows him from his preordination all the way through a number of years as his faith is kind of tested. basically the book starts with he's out in the desert and he's fasting for Lent. He's supposed to be silent. He's not supposed to interact with anybody. He's supposed to just sit and pray and starve, basically. But all of a sudden, an old pilgrim kind of passes by and causes him to find, through a series of misunderstandings, there's some good humor in there, too, actually, of him interacting with the hermit and being, or not hermit, but like pilgrim, and be like, I'm not supposed to talk, but I still want to say something to you, or something like that. But anyway, through a series of misunderstandings, the pilgrim reveals to Francis a little passage. And when I say passage, I mean like a tunnel. And the pilgrim goes on his way, and Francis goes to dig into this tunnel and see what the hell it is. And what he finds is an old fallout shelter. Now, already in this book, it's been established that this is, a few hundred years after the Earth was destroyed in nuclear fire, kind of thing. Humanity is mostly gone. There are mutants and all kinds of crazy stuff running around. Most of the world is desert, yada yada yada. But all of a sudden, Francis kind of walks down and finds this fallout shelter that's all sealed up, and there's like an anteroom that isn't sealed. He goes in there, and to him, it's like a miracle. He finds a bunch of old papers and stuff, and the papers are actually signed by this Leibowitz guy. He's a member of the Order of the Blessed Leibowitz, and Leibowitz, in this part, is kind of been beatified, right? He's kind of like pre-sainthood, but he's not a saint yet. And, it looks like these objects are actually, items from Leibowitz himself. So naturally, Francis is a little bit freaked out and a little bit overjoyed and a little bit overenthusiastic. He tries to tell, a monk comes by to take his confession, and he tries to tell him about the stuff that he found, and the monk thinks that he's got, desert fever. Then after that, Francis goes back to the monastery, and he tries to show the things that he has. And while the fellow initiates are kind of happy for him and even kind of go to an extent of, like, what would you call it? Like kind of embellishing the stories that he tells about what happened, the leadership at the monastery is really, really down on him about this. He gets punished for not denying that what he found is possibly a relic of the Blessed Leibowitz. And so Francis is kind of stuck between these two forces. And his personality hurts him too, because he refuses to say for sure that the pilgrim that he saw, by the way, the pilgrim was supposed to go by the monastery, but never showed up, kind of thing. There's some cool little bits of like, ooh, what really happened here? Is this supernatural or not, kind of thing going on. And Francis is kind of he's like, I don't think it was Leibowitz, but I don't know because I've never seen the real Leibowitz. And so, he gets beaten up a bit because he won't say that he didn't see something that he's not supposed to have seen. And this hurts him because not only is he kind of beaten with sticks every once in a while by the leadership for this, but they also deny him full monkhood for a good number of years. I think it's like somewhere between like 10 and 15 years, where he should have become a monk but doesn't. And they're kind of like, well, this guy's kind of crazy and we need to... It's really cool because when you first read it, you feel like these guys are, maybe you're feeling like, oh, these guys don't really believe their religion, and you think it's going to go and get that kind of twist where there's like, like the leadership of the religion is like super cynical and they're just like, stuff like that. And it doesn't actually go that way. It turns out that the resistance of the leadership was more because they wanted Leibowitz to be canonized, to be sainted, and if they, as the Order of Leibowitz, provide evidence for Leibowitz to be sainted, it will be seen with skepticism more than acceptance. And so, like, him finding this is a great thing, but they need to shut him up until they can get, a less biased or biased appearing group to go check it out. And every time he kind of opens his stupid mouth, they're like, oh, it's going to ruin the standard for our whole order kind of thing. It's, it's one of those things where it feels weird when you read it and then it gets explained and you're like, oh, neat. Eventually, Francis gets gets inducted into the monkhood or priesthood or whatever, and he's told to work on copying old books and stuff like that. They have these casks of old books that they make copies of. Some of them are religious texts, some of them are like physics textbooks that have been partly burnt in the firestorm of the apocalypse kind of thing. And one of the things that Francis found when he went into that fallout shelter anteroom area was a blueprint. It's actually a circuit diagram, an old circuit diagram. And what Francis decides to do is he decides to make an artistic, you know how when you look at books from like really, really old, they have like the scrollery around them and the letters are all very artistic and all that. He's going to do an illuminated copy of the blueprint. And so he spends 15 years of his life working on this art because everything is very, very slow there. And he's only allowed to work on this like an hour a day or something like that. Over this 15 years, he meets with the canonization process for Leibowitz continues. And so the advocate for Leibowitz shows up and he asks Francis about his story. And Francis discovers that everyone else who's been talking about this has been totally embellishing everything in like crazy ways. He's like, no, it's not like that at all. This is what I saw. And the advocate's like, no, it's okay, blah, 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 blah. And then after that, we even get a scene where he meets with the devil's advocate, which is the guy who was advocating against Leibowitz's canonization. And that's a really cool kind of back and forth as well. Because even the devil's advocate starts to kind of see that Francis is earnest in what he sees or what he believes he saw. And so, and at this point, Francis is also pretty old, and he kind of understands what's going on. So he's on pins and needles as well. It's a really cool scene. Finally, the decision is made to canonize Leibowitz, and Francis, being the guy who discovered this stuff that helped get him canonized, and as someone who's been working on this illuminated copy of the blueprint, gets sent to New Rome to present the blueprint and the copy to the Pope. And on the way there, he gets attacked by a bandit. And the bandit steals the illuminated copy because it looks nicer, because of the artistic value of it. It's not just a blueprint. And so Francis presents the blueprint to the Pope and kind of apologizes to him. He's like, I feel sorry that I wasted 15 years of my life on this copy. And the Pope is even though he gets a very, very short part in the book, he's a really interesting character, where he's very familiar, and he like Francis is like, did he wink at me when he made this statement? But basically he says, those 15 years of your life were not wasted because you spent them in an effort that you thought was worth something, and that effort protected the real blueprint and allowed you to bring it here to us. And that is hands down my favorite part of the first part of this book, which isn't to say that there aren't other interesting bits like the various discussions I talked about earlier. There's the idea that a fallout is some kind of a demon, and therefore a fallout shelter protects demons, right? There's the idea that they're trying to rebuild the theory of the electron from fragments of texts and destroyed books. That they have all these weird ideas, and they have these weird classifications based on like kind of an older, kind of pre-scientific view of reality. Is it a science or an art? Blah, 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 blah. Stuff like that. There's some cool taxonomy there. And then I think the idea of an illuminated copy of a circuit diagram is really funny and cool. So there's that too. And, by the way, this part has, I think, the best handled overall humor in the book. So that's the thing that made the other two parts so irritating to me, is like, clearly Miller can do humor, and then he screws it up in the other two parts of the book in these, bombastic ways, but we'll get to that in a second. So part 2 is titled Fiat Lux, or Let There Be Light. And it was here that I started to think, like, these part titles are Bible quotes, but it's not actually that simple. So I'll get to there in a minute. But basically, this second part happens about 700 years later. Civilization has returned to roughly a Middle Ages kind of level. The monks are continuing their work, but now large states and armies are making names for themselves and kind of conquering various parts of the world. This part has a relatively large amount of kind of political wrangling, a little bit of intrigue, a little bit of backstabbing, a little bit of planning and plotting and stuff like that, which gives it kind of a nice edge here and there. But it's mostly about the visit of a secular scholar to the monastery. We follow this Abbot Paolo, who's, I think he's dying of like a stomach ulcer of some sort or something like that, but he's basically got to deal with the situation of this scholar showing up, as well as the simultaneous development, or I guess rediscovery, of basically an arc lamp, which is happening at the monastery right then. There's a lot that happens in this chunk of the book because of these things. But to me, the most interesting part of this chunk of the book was the argument about more widely publishing and dispersing the works that are held by the monastery. This secular scholar, Thadeo or something like that, he's got some weird name, but he's basically a well-known scholar in the secular world, and the scholar wants to take the works to the city. They have more money, they have more equipment there to work on this stuff and try to understand it. But the abbot refuses. He's worried that giving the gift of technology to the men with power, now that there are these large kingdoms effectively, will be more destructive than positive. And he says, quote, "Men must fumble a while with error to separate it from truth, I think, as long as they don't seize the error hungrily because it has a pleasanter taste." Now, this is a really interesting perspective for someone like me, for a scientist in general, because the idea that, we can do better research if we have more funds, but at the same time, the abbot is saying, well, wait a minute. If what your research does, if the net effect of it is to put more power into the hands of people who, basically kill other people or subjugate other people or destroy the world again, then we might end up making the same mistake that caused the first apocalypse. And so, there's this very interesting tension there, and the discussion that they have about it is actually really interesting, I thought. We have a side character in this part of the book called the poet, who is alternately cryptic and frustrating, and then sometimes he's very profound. He has this glass eye that he calls his removable conscience. And there's this really interesting little story about that. And then his eye shows up later in the story, which I think is a really neat touch. There's one point that I have about this part as a physicist that I thought was fun, where one of the monks appears to rediscover what I believe is Einstein notation. I'm not a general relativist. That's not where my focus was, but I know enough general relativity that to know that there was this very truncated method that Einstein came up with for denoting basically mathematical operations in calculus in tensors, and that's called Einstein notation. And one of the monks appears to rediscover that in this part of the story. I don't want to spoil too much of this. I don't want to spoil too much, right? But we have some warring factions that are kind of the background. We have the scholar having tension with the abbot. We have the abbot having tension with the other stuff. There's a really cool part where they're trying to build this arc lamp. They think they came up with a way to make an arc lamp, and there's this cool little description of how they have wires on wagon wheels and stuff like that. But there's an interesting argument where the librarian, they need a place to hang the arc lamp, and the librarian. And the best place they want to do this is, or that they think to do this, is by removing a cross that's hanging up in the library. And the librarian is very much against this. He's like, we shouldn't remove the image of God in order to put the technology there in its place. At first the abbot's like, well, this is a library, it's not a church. We can put the images wherever we want them to be. It doesn't need to be hanging here. We can move it. It's not a big deal. And then by the end, his interaction with the scholar, kind of at the end, he's like, put the cross back where it was, and we're going to make that our focus and not necessarily just the raw implementation of technology. I think it was a really interesting kind of little mini arc there, and I guess it's an arc lamp, right? A little bit of development there that I really enjoyed. So that's part 2. Finally, the third part is titled Fiat Voluntas Tua, and I had to look this one up because I didn't know what it meant. But it turns out this means "Thy will be done," and I think this is probably from the Lord's Prayer, the Latin version of it. So this is a point where I was like, oh, the titles are not just from the Bible; they're like important lines from the Catholic canon and prayers. So for what it's worth, this is kind of a shift from and maybe it's in maybe "Thy will be done" is in Genesis as well, but I don't know. That's where I remember that phrase from, right? So anyway. Again, we jump forward 700 years. We're back to a moderately futuristic civilization, a little bit beyond where we are now. They have self-driving cars. And, as I mentioned in the non-spoiler section, the first chapter of this part of the book is so weird and off-puttingly whimsical and confusing and full of really badly executed humor. I mentioned before, it's like a bad Douglas Adams. Like, Douglas Adams was a skilled satirist. But then if you take Douglas Adams and you do a bad parody or a bad imitation of Douglas Adams, that's what this felt like. There's like a script portion, and there's a bunch of Latin that there's someone singing a song, and there's like someone talking about like the deity of daily shaving. It's weird, and it proceeds on, and then a guy has a machine that's supposed to take dictation for him, and like it's causing problems, and there's all kinds of weird, like there's a chunk of backwards text and all kinds of goofy stuff. And so like that first chapter was like, what happened here? This was pretty good, and all of a sudden it's frustrating and goofy and doesn't make any sense. And then finally, once you get past that first chapter and a half of goofiness at the start of the third part, things actually start to get pretty good. So once we get past the irritating part of the irritating first chunk of the third part of the book, we discovered that in this part we're going to be following around an abbot Dom Zerchi, and he's dealing with his duties and events that are related to, if you'll believe it, another potentially apocalyptic war that might be breaking out. Here I don't want to spoil too much, because there's a lot going on here that I think is kind of interesting and fun to go through. But what I'll say is that in this part, I found 3 very interesting ideas that are discussed or brought up or explained in a thought-provoking way. Number 1, their plan is to send a branch of the church to basically a space colony around a planet that happens to be orbiting Alpha Centauri. And the idea is that they need the church and the church's knowledge to survive another apocalyptic war. Once again, the state has gotten hold of nuclear weapons effectively, and as a result, the world's going to be destroyed again, they're pretty sure. And this is an interesting side issue, because what we find out while learning about kind of this idea of sending this branch of the church away is that we kind of see firsthand, at least we see Walter Miller's perspective on the ability of governments and the media to lie to people about what's really happening, and his fear, I think, that humanity is inevitably self-destructive. There's an interesting quote here where I kind of disagree with him a little bit. But he says, quote, "A new exodus from Egypt under the auspices of a god who must surely be very weary of the race of man," end quote. But, I feel like this is a bit of pessimism popping in where if a real believer, might say instead that perhaps God can never tire of man, and that's why we persist. Number 2 idea that I thought was really cool and really interesting was a discussion of the morality of mercy killing. Now, one of the books that I've read that kind of touches on this as well is On the Beach by Neville Shute, right? And, in that book, everybody kind of just, follows what they're told to do. But in this book, we don't have that. We have the abbot Zerchi, who is, basically like opposed to any kind of mercy killing or merciful suicide or something like that. Based on a very what appears to be a very genuine and honest belief in what he has learned as a man of religion. Based on this thing, we get a huge amount of really thought-provoking dialogue. We get argument. We get individual people pondering. We have some action that shows up in the book as related to this discussion, and it all works out really well. And this is one of the parts of the book that I thought was like, holy cow, this is really interesting. And the questions that are being raised here are actually very thought-provoking and interesting. I mean, you have to think to yourself, whether you believe in God or not, or whether you believe that God commands X or Y or not, could you know what it looks like to die of radiation poisoning and tell someone who has a fatal dose of radiation to endure it. It's one of those things where, like, you could see it actually being a test of someone's faith in a very real way, right? Like, you see a person, screaming, and their friggin' organs are liquefying, and they're like, no, you have to endure it, because that's what God demands, kind of thing. It's kind of, or not even demands. Like, I think that even comes up where it's like, well, God's demanding us to suffer, and the guy's like, no, it's not that. What he wants is for you to endure the pain that has been sent to you by Satan. It's like, I don't know how like true it is to actual like ideological beliefs either now or at the time, but like it's a really interesting perspective, and I think it's worth looking at and thinking about. And then at the very, very end, we get something that kind of ties back to the earlier chunks of the book, and we discover that even the head people of the church can't necessarily see holiness where it really exists sometimes. And I'm not going to spoil this part because it's really interesting and weird and kind of puts the whole book in a different perspective. Not really puts the whole book in a different perspective, but it puts the whole part of the book in a different, or at least it puts a good chunk of things in a different perspective. And I think that, this would be something for me not to spoil, even in the spoiler section. So I'll just say that. I'll say that there's a hint of unsureness or questioningness right at the end that is like, oh, wow, that's also something for someone who was so into his faith to, say this about radiation sickness, for this to then happen to him is like kind of weird and a big deal and interesting. And so I'll just leave it there. Anyway, that's all I want to do for the spoiler section. Let's get into the conclusion. All right, in conclusion, all in all, this is a book that made me want to put it down multiple times for being annoying or frustrating or trying too hard to be funny. But man, pushing through it, there are some really interesting little chunks of thought in here that are really worth thinking about. And when I say thought, I don't mean like what we often think of as science fiction, big ideas in science fiction, where like, oh, this person had a really interesting and maybe accurate or maybe inaccurate view of what the future might look like. Or this person thought up this technology. He came up with the idea that quantum computers might be used to do this, or he thought of, encryption before encryption was really a thing. And he didn't know any of the math, but he said, maybe people will have something like this someday. We get a lot of ideas like that in science fiction where they're about the world building, or they're about, something like some kind of technology existing. And this book isn't really like that. The idea that like the setting is not particularly like out of this world, right? There's nothing in the setting that's that innovative, I guess. You can see settings like this in different books if you want. And at the same time, there's not really a vision of futurism here that is something that Miller is trying to show to us. Instead, what he's showing us are some interesting ideas that have persisted for thousands of years and will probably continue to persist for thousands of years, and his perspective on those ideas. And in that sense, I think it really succeeds. We have a balanced mix of world building and these kinds of ideas, which are, not the same kind of ideas that you get in a lot of science fiction books. And we even have a lot of action in various places. We have very good dialogue for the most part, very satisfying arguments, and good characters that are arguing with each other in good faith. There's a bit of crypticness nowadays for the modern reader because of the large amount of Latin. But I guess, as I mentioned in the first section, Latin was in more common use when this book was written, compared to how I grew up. So there's that. I don't think that Miller would have been able to predict that the Latin Mass would go away within the next 20 years of his book being published. One of the negative points of this book is that it tucks most of the really interesting bits right near the end, in the third part, and kind of protects them with a wall of frustrating exposition and bad humor. But at the same time, it's still very rewarding. I still felt like it was a very rewarding read for a first read through, and there's enough connective tissue between the parts that isn't like that is not obvious, that I think even a second reading of this book might be rewarding. So those are my thoughts on A Canticle for Leibowitz. Apparently, there's a sequel to this book that came out 40 years later. At the end of the copy that I read through, there was a chapter of the next book which has an even weirder title. So anyway, that's what I've got. Hope you enjoyed. Very interesting book. I'll have links in the description where you can read it for free if you want. And yeah, have a great week, and I will see you next time.